let's jump into this deep dive, and we're going to be talking all about China's rise.
Okay.
We're looking at an episode of Al Jazeera English's The Take that really kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of China's current global position.
Yeah.
And you know what's really fascinating about this episode is that the correspondent actually lived in China like 2 decades ago.
Oh, wow.
And recently revisited. So they're offering this really unique perspective on how much has actually changed.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a really cool perspective.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting about it is how it highlights kind of these contrasting realities of China today. So on the one hand, you have them like strategically seizing global opportunities.
Right.
But then on the other hand, they're dealing with some pretty serious domestic economic issues.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because it's almost like these two things are feeding into each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to be unpacking today. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is how they explore the impact of the Trump administration's trade policies on China.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, the correspondent actually argues that Trump's actions, particularly the tariffs on Chinese goods, may have actually unintentionally fueled China's growth.
Oh, wow. That's kind of a mind-blowing argument.
It is. It is. And some of the reporting that they do is actually from Yiwu, which is the world's largest small commodities market.
Okay.
And they talk to a bunch of different suppliers there. And there's a mix of anxiety and resilience, I would say, among these businesses.
Right, because some of those suppliers are super reliant on exporting to the U.S.
Exactly.
So, of course, they'd be a little nervous.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, you have this one manufacturer, and I think it was a treadmill company that they interviewed.
Okay.
And they send a third of their production to the U.S.
Wow.
But they haven't seen any drop in orders.
Really?
The reason why is because there are no alternative suppliers in the U.S. that have kind of stepped up.
So they're kind of stuck.
Yeah. It really illustrates how deeply intertwined the U.S. and Chinese economies are.
It really does.
Despite all of the, you know, the political tensions.
Right.
And it suggests that trying to, like, decouple the two could have some pretty serious unintended consequences for both sides.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a lose-lose situation in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and in a way, you could argue that this actually ended up pushing China to innovate and seek new markets.
Right.
And that might have actually ended up strengthening their position globally.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's kind of like a game of economic chess where each move has these ripple effects across the board.
Oh, I like that analogy, yeah.
But, you know, we can't talk about China's rise without talking about technology and particularly the rise of AI.
Oh, absolutely. That's like their big thing right now.
Yeah. And I always love a good anecdote. And the correspondent shares this really funny story about how he got to try on this 6-armed robotic vest in China.
A 6-armed robotic vest?
Yeah, he said the strength of this thing was unbelievable. And then they show these humanoid robots that have like facial expressions that are so realistic, it's almost creepy.
It's like the uncanny valley, you know?
Yeah, and all of this is powered by AI.
Yeah, AI is really changing everything.
It is, and it's remarkable how fast China has progressed in robotics and AI.
Yeah, you know, people think of the U.S. as being the leader in that space.
Right.
But China's catching up extremely quickly.
They are. And the correspondent really emphasizes, you know, how quickly they're closing that gap, especially when it comes to integrating AI into their technology.
So they're not just copying, they're innovating.
Exactly. And it's not just robotics. They've launched their own independent AI systems.
Oh, really?
DeepSeek and Manos.
I haven't heard of those.
Yeah, and these are platforms that have the potential to like completely reshape entire industries.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Manufacturing, healthcare, finance, all completely revolutionized.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how they're going to leverage this, you know, this growing technological power.
Yeah, like, is it going to be a force for global cooperation competition or maybe a little bit of both?
Right.
Who knows?
It's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that they actually highlight this challenge that China is facing right now, and it's kind of a weird one. It's an excess of savings and a surplus of housing.
What?
Yeah, it's almost the opposite of what a lot of countries are struggling with.
That's so strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, most countries are dealing with debt and housing shortages.
Exactly. But it's a problem that's kind of born from their rapid economic growth.
Okay. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, their property boom has been fueled by these really high savings rates.
Okay.
And it's actually led to a pretty crazy situation. They have something like 60 million vacant homes.
60 million.
Oh.
That's enough to house the entire population of the UK.
I know, it's unbelievable.
Wow.
And it's not just about empty buildings, it's also a sign of potential economic stagnation. Yeah, and the correspondent shares this really sad story about this pizza place called Happy Pizza in Yinko.
Happy pizza.
Yeah, and it was opened in this ghost city that was built for a boom that never actually materialized.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
It's a stark reminder that economic growth without balanced development can have some really, really profound consequences.
Yeah, for sure.
And it underscores this challenge that China faces in making sure that prosperity reaches all parts of society and that they can kind of avoid these pitfalls of overbuilding and things like that.
Right, because it's not just about, making sure everyone has a home.
Right.
It's about making sure those homes are actually in places where people want to live.
Exactly. And where there are jobs and,
A sense of community.
Exactly.
Right.
And not just this, this over-reliance on the property market.
Yeah, because what happens if that bubble bursts?
Exactly. That's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, it's a big risk for sure. Yeah, it's a really tough situation, trying to balance all of that, making sure the growth is actually benefiting the people and that it's sustainable. And all of this is happening while China is really stepping onto the world stage in this much more assertive way.
Yeah, they're not shying away from that leadership role, are they?
Not at all. And the correspondent actually highlights this quote from Foreign Minister Wang Yi that I think really captures this shift.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
He criticizes the law of the jungle. And he really calls for increased international cooperation.
It's a really interesting statement, especially when you think about it in the context of, some people are saying that the U.S. is kind of retreating from global leadership.
Right, and the correspondent actually uses the reduction in U.S. foreign aid as an example.
Oh, yeah, and how that's impacting refugee camps in Southeast Asia.
Exactly.
It's creating this void, and it seems like China is more than happy to step in.
Yeah, they're ready to fill that gap.
And then there's also the case of the Uyghur prisoners in Thailand.
Oh, right, the ones that were repatriated to China.
Yeah, and it's really unclear what's going to happen to them.
Yeah, that's a really concerning situation.
It's being seen by some as, China kind of filling this power vacuum that's been left by the U.S.
Right, and it definitely raises some really serious questions about what China's growing global influence actually means.
Exactly. Like, on one hand, they're advocating for international cooperation.
Right.
But on the other hand, their actions on issues like human rights are making people really nervous.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're going to be under a lot of scrutiny as they take on this larger role on the world stage.
Absolutely. So with all of these external and internal forces kind of pushing and pulling, what's the mood like inside China?
That's a good question.
Yeah, the correspondent talked to a lot of different people and found a really interesting mix of emotions.
Like what?
Well, there's definitely a sense of national pride,
Of course.
but there's also this kind of lingering sense of caution.
I can see that. I mean, a lot of Chinese citizens have lived through some really tough times. Economic hardship, and those experiences definitely shape how they see the world.
They've seen how quickly things can change,
Exactly.
but it wasn't all doom and gloom. The correspondent also noticed this newfound confidence.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like a feeling of security that's rooted in the country's increased affluence and stability.
Okay, so it's like they're finally starting to feel the benefits of their economic miracle.
Exactly. And the correspondent said it was a stark contrast to the insecurity that they observed 2 decades ago.
That's a pretty big shift in mindset.
It is, and it suggests that the Chinese people are maybe becoming more comfortable with the current social contract.
You mean trading some personal liberties for economic well-being and national strength?
Right.
It's a tough trade-off.
It is, and it's something that a lot of countries struggle with.
Yeah, but it seems like the stakes are even higher in China.
Especially given how fast they're rising and how complex their political system is.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if this sense of security is going to last.
Right. What happens if things start to go wrong?
Or if people start demanding more freedom.
Exactly. Will this social contract hold as China continues to evolve? Or will there be this growing tension between the desire for economic prosperity and the yearning for greater personal freedoms?
That's the big question.
Yeah, it really makes you think, like, how much are we willing to give up for a comfortable life?
It's a question every society has to wrestle with.
Yeah, for sure. But it feels particularly relevant in China right now.
Given their unique history and where they're headed.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a second and think about the big picture. what are the big takeaways from our deep dive into China's rise?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that China's story is one of incredible dynamism, but also these inherent contradictions.
Yeah, we've seen that throughout this whole conversation.
They're a superpower, but they're still working through some serious internal issues.
Right, and it's not just that they're this technological powerhouse, they're pushing the boundaries of AI, but then you have millions of people living in these ghost cities.
It's like their economic miracle hasn't reached everyone equally.
And that's what makes it so fascinating how they're navigating this duality.
Right.
On one hand, they're stepping into this global leadership role. They're talking about cooperation and moving away from these old power dynamics.
Right, like that law of the jungle idea.
Exactly. But then their actions on things like human rights are definitely raising concerns about what this new world order might actually look like.
Yeah, it's a really complicated picture.
It is, and it's important to remember that this isn't happening in isolation.
Right.
It's all happening against this backdrop of shifting geopolitical alliances, economic uncertainties, and of course these technological advancements that are changing the world as we know it.
It's like everything's in flux right now.
Exactly. So where do we go from here? I mean, understanding China's trajectory is crucial for anyone who wants to understand the 21st century.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's so multifaceted. Where do you even begin?
I think the most important thing is to resist the temptation to oversimplify things.
Yeah, like good versus evil or democracy versus authoritarianism. It's way more nuanced than that.
Yeah. It's about understanding the complexities, engaging with different perspectives, and challenging your own assumptions.
It's so easy to fall into that trap of binary thinking.
Especially with a country like China that's so different from our own.
But the reality is their story, like all human stories, is one of complexity and contradiction.
And I think by embracing that complexity, we can move beyond these simple narratives and actually start to understand what's shaping China's future and how that's going to impact our own lives.
Wow, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
You know, we've explored the economic marvels, the technological leaps, the geopolitical maneuvering, and the human stories that all come together to create this really intricate tapestry of China's rise.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
But this is really just the beginning of the conversation.
Oh yeah, there's so much more to uncover and learn.
So much more to think about.
And I think that's the most important thing to take away from this deep dive. It's not about having all the answers, but about sparking that curiosity and encouraging further exploration.
So, to our listener, we'll leave you with this. Keep asking questions, keep seeking out diverse perspectives, and keep diving deep.
The journey of understanding China and the world really is one of continuous learning and discovery.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.